Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff. We're very glad to welcome back to the program Dr. Shir Hever, who's a scholar of Israel's occupation, apartheid, and genocide. Born in Israel and currently living in Germany. He's the managing director of the Alliance for Justice Between Israelis and Palestinians, and his latest book is The Privatization of Israeli Security. Dr. Hever, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I mean, I wish it was for better reason, but
Yeah.
Here we are. So earlier this month, Netanyahu said Israel would spend 350 billion shekels, that's roughly $110 billion, on developing their own arms in order to reduce dependency on foreign countries. And this comes about a week after the U.S. passed a $900 billion war budget, which includes expanded military support for Israel, marked to fill the gaps in Israeli military capabilities due to global embargoes. So starting us off here, what has the real effect been on the ground in terms of these arms embargoes? And what do you think is actually Israel's capacity to become militarily independent?
Israel has no capacity to become militarily independent. This is complete fantasy. I think everyone in Israel knows this very well. Netanyahu actually gave a speech where he said that because of the military embargo, Israel has to become a super Sparta, meaning that Israel will make its own weapons and will become a fully militaristic society in which everyone serves in the military their entire lives. This is basically what Sparta was, or at least what it was in the imagination of Israelis who learn about the history of ancient Greece. It's not exactly accurate history, but it is what Netanyahu meant. And as soon as he gave that speech, there was panic in Israel. The stock market crashed. He had to take it back the next day. But the problem is that by taking it back, he didn't actually say anything new. He didn't say, oh, but don't worry, we're going to get our weapons somewhere else, because they simply cannot get enough weapons. Now, you mentioned the U.S. is spending a lot more on the military, which is, of course, a fact that I'm not disputing. But what part of this actually goes as weapons that go to Israel for free, that Israel will not have to pay for? This remains to be seen. We don't know yet. We know that the current memorandum of understanding that was actually written by President Obama back in 2016 is a 10-year agreement that will end next year in 2016. So Israel is now very nervous about negotiating an extension of this agreement with the Trump administration. There are quite a lot of voices coming from the Trump administration which are saying maybe we shouldn't just extend it for another 10 years because maybe Israel should start paying for their weapons. And Israel cannot. They don't have the financial resources for it. So also the statement that Netanyahu made about $110 billion that Israel will invest in its developing its own military industry, it's again part of this fantasy. There is no reality behind it. First of all, they're saying that they're not just going to make all the weapons that they need, and they don't have the technology for these weapons. Israel is relying very heavily on suicide drones, on assassination drones, quadcopters that are being used very extensively in Gaza as well as in the West Bank to assassinate people. These drones contain engines that the only companies that know how to make these engines are in China. So without importing those engines, the drones don't fly. But in addition to this, Israel is also saying they're going to make the materials for the weapons. Now, this is not exactly how chemistry works. You cannot, spend money and create mines for minerals that don't exist in the territory that you control. So Israel will continue to have to import materials for weapons, and this is simply illegal. It's illegal to sell weapons and dual-use items, which include also materials that can be used to make weapons, explosives, and so on, to countries that are committing genocide, that are committing war crimes, that are standing trial in international courts for those crimes. And because it's illegal, there is an ongoing legal battle fought in every European country to stop the weapon shipments. And this legal battle is gradually progressing forward. So it is making gains, and more arms shipments are being stopped. either by the courts or by unions, because the dock workers know their rights, and they also know that they cannot break the law by loading weapons on ships or servicing ships that are breaking the law. So they have not just the right, but also the obligation to stop the weapons. So this does mean that there is an impact on the ground, and Israel is feeling this impact very much. I think that if you're looking at the news in Israel, and I am every day, and reading the newspapers, Israelis are speaking about the situation as if the war has ended. But I mean, in the everyday conversations in the news, the war is over. But at the same time, they are now saying that there might be another round of war with Iran, and the reservists are still mostly not released. So most of the reservists are still serving, which costs a lot of money, and which is also a result of the shortage of weapons, because Israel doesn't have enough of those very high-tech weapons that are saving on person power and are enabling them to control large tracts of territory. So they continue to depend on just foot soldiers with a gun controlling the territory, and this whole dissection of the Gaza Strip into the yellow line and the red zone and so on, all these areas where they're killing people every day. And they're killing these people with the weapons that are running out. So actually this is not an ideal situation for the Israeli government either. Of course, I mean, let's not put things on the same level as civilians in Gaza who are being killed every day. Also civilians in the West Bank who are being terrorized and brutalized and also killed in large numbers and injured and so on. So the Palestinians are suffering very much, and there is no real ceasefire on the ground. But from the point of view of the Israeli government, they have a problem, because the far right wants to resume the full onslaught of the genocide in Gaza, and even to settle Gaza with Israeli settlements, and they want. So they're pushing the government for more brutality and violence. At the same time, the economy is very weak and very tired from the war, and people expect it to be over and talk about it as if it is already over. But then they say, well, if the war is over, then there's going to be some accountability, maybe an investigation into the role of the government in enabling the faults in intelligence and defense that enabled the October 7th attack in the first place, and there need to be another election and so on. And this immediately puts the government into emergency mode, where they say, well, we need another war. And the war would be a way to push aside all of these talks about accountability and investigations, because there's an emergency, because the state might be destroyed, and so on. So this is something that really puts them in a difficult situation. And in order to have the ability to continue the aggression, they need more weapons, and they don't have them.
Well, with that, I mean, you said that basically Israeli media, and indeed U.S. media, because it basically just parrots Hasbara, but is saying that, oh, the ceasefire, it's all good, everything's done, we can move on with our lives, and yet, of course, it's not. So what does that clash, that juxtaposition, what effect does that have? I understand that Germany paused weapons shipments, but then they started them up again after the so-called ceasefire. So what effect does this have on the legality if everyone's pretending that this so-called ceasefire is holding?
Well, you know how courts work. They don't work based on public opinion or catchy headlines in the newspapers. That's not how the legal system works. When the ceasefire came into effect on October 10th, the ceasefire that was brokered by Trump, or imposed by Trump, I should say, and it's not really a ceasefire, but it was presented as a ceasefire, at least a one-sided one, because Palestinian forces have mostly respected it in a one-sided way. But when this happened, then Germany said, well, we can resume arms shipments. But that is not true. Legally speaking, it's not true. It's just a populist statement. And in fact, there is a big difference between making a statement, we will resume arms shipments, and at the same time, those shipments that they want to send have to be reviewed, each and every one. And every arms, there is a difference between licensing arms exports and actually shipping them. And there's licensing in larger numbers than the actual amount that is being sold, because you have a license to sell a certain weapon. And then if the actual weapons are being delivered, then some people have made themselves culpable of a serious crime, and they could go to prison for it. So if the government makes a statement, the statement itself could be considered a crime as well, but it's a different level of crime than actually sending the weapons. And both of these are being investigated right now. And from the point of view of the Israeli public and the Israeli media, because they say, oh, well, the war is over, then the Israeli government actually sent a document to the International Criminal Court and said, well, you should cancel the investigation against Israel and the arrest warrant against Prime Minister Netanyahu and other senior Israelis because the war is over. But of course, that's not how it works. You don't murder people and then say, well, I've stopped murdering them, so now you can't arrest me for it. So it's interesting that the Israeli own legal system, like the lawyers that work for the Israeli government directly, they're the ones who are supposed to represent Israel in front of the International Criminal Courts. And they didn't write the note to the ICC. They didn't write it because they thought this is just legal nonsense. And they found some legal attaché to the Israeli embassy to the Netherlands who agreed to write the note on behalf of the Israeli government, because that's the only person who would debase themselves by putting their name on this paper, expecting the court. And of course, the ICC rejected the claim right away. I mean, this is goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, just in case the listeners are not aware of this.
Yeah, well, and I mean, this is speaking legally, but also speaking economically. I mean, I know as an American how you can just perpetually be at war, even though the economics make absolutely no sense. You can just create that money. But with the idea of attacking Iran again, which did not end well for Israel last time, and still keeping this quote unquote ceasefire in Gaza, which is not a ceasefire, and trying to implement these settlements. I mean, can Israel do all of this at once and actually still, even if it gets free weapons from the US, like, could it still continue all this? I mean, how many continuous fronts and amplified fronts can it, ethnically cleanse and be at war at without just collapsing?
What you call perpetual war is something that is part of this mythology, which in the Israeli vocabulary would be called Sparta. This is what Netanyahu was talking about in his Sparta speech. Of course, the United States, as a world hegemon, as a global empire, can do things that other countries cannot. And even if the US constantly maintains conflicts and occupations and wars all over the world, it does so with a lot of proxies, for example, by using Israel as its proxy, but using also regional proxies. It was the intellectual and scholar Trita Parsi who mentioned in a podcast recently that Israel cannot be considered a regional hegemon if its wars are funded by somebody else. So if it cannot fund its own wars, then it's not really a hegemon. It remains a proxy. So the question of whether Israel can or cannot continue the genocide in Gaza, can or cannot go to another war with Iran, all of these questions, and there are other fronts and other threats. Israel is threatening its neighbors, and now it starts another political crisis by recognizing Somaliland. So these things are all opportunities for the Israeli government to create a crisis in which people are going to be killed. But the question is, how much can Israel continue to do this doesn't depend just on Israel, because if it did, then I would just say it cannot. It depends on the willingness of the West, and especially the United States, to support those wars. And I think that in Europe, we're seeing a steep decline in the willingness to support Israel's aggression. We see more and more European countries that are standing up and saying, well, this is not in line with our own interests. And the United States, of course, is not going to have any moral qualms about the Israeli aggressions. But there are voices within the US who are saying that this may not be in the interest of the United States, and that Israel is becoming a burden on the United States. And these voices are heard loud and clear in Israel, and cause Israelis to really worry. And this worry is in itself an economic phenomenon. We shouldn't discount the psychological response of people when they see that the BDS movement continues to grow and become stronger and stronger, and Israelis cannot go on a trip to Europe and expose themselves as Israelis without feeling that people see them as part of the system of genocide. And they cannot, go to a vacation in Greece and then say, "Oh, but didn't you hear the war is over?" Because maybe they, in their own media, they're feeding themselves these lies. But the people in Europe are getting their media elsewhere, not from the Israeli sources. So they are getting worried, and they're getting frustrated, and they continue to leave. A lot of Israelis are still leaving in very large numbers. Every month or so, there's a new report, a new analysis about the demographics of the people who are leaving and how they are leaving and in what ways. And I also see this. I see how these former Israelis are creating colonies, so to speak, in countries like Cyprus, Greece, Portugal, Germany, where they buy real estate or rent real estate. They try to stay together as groups, also because they really feel like pariahs. They feel ostracized. So they stay together in groups. They also don't leave for political reasons. So many of them are still, Zionists and support the genocide, but they just don't want to raise their children in this crumbling economy. So they're leaving, but they still have the same politics. And this is something that is noticed. I've seen a sign in the airport of Athens, Greece, which said in Hebrew, a huge sign in Hebrew in the airport, which said, "Don't leave Greece without buying a home first." It was an advertisement for a real estate company. And I'm also thinking, what do Greek people think when they see this gigantic sign in a foreign language of all these people coming from Israel, people who are known for, occupying and ethnically cleansing and colonizing Palestine? Unfortunately, it really feeds into also xenophobic and right-wing, sentiments in those countries, because Israelis who are usually especially the Israeli government, who is really on very good terms with the most xenophobic and racist governments in Europe, and very happy to offer Israeli technology for dealing with unwanted refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, and so on, are suddenly finding themselves on the other side of this.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay. I needed to process that for a second. And I do want to circle back to, because I saw long lines of people waiting for Portuguese citizenship and that whole thing. But I also wanted to ask you, in terms of effects on not just the economy, but again, the psychology. Last week, major insurance companies Allianz and Aviva reportedly dropped Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli arms manufacturer. And I'm wondering, what is the effect of this? And do you think that will have a domino effect? And of course, that would then affect Israel's ability to, make its own weapons, even though you already debunked that as a independent possibility. But what are these insurance companies seeing? Because it's not a moral qualm, right? So what are they seeing that might affect other insurance companies or other economic banking systems and the like to walk away from Israel?
Elbit Systems is Israel's largest arms company. And it was actually founded just as Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Syrian Golan. So in 67, Elbit, it started as a joint project between a private company and the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And it was under the idea that because of the occupation of Palestinian territory and Syrian territory and Egyptian territory as well, but this has been given back by now, then Israel was facing a military embargo. The military embargo was imposed by Israel's largest arms supplier at the time, which was France. Elbit Systems said, we're going to make those weapons instead, domestically. And they failed miserably because just 6 years after Elbit Systems was started to deal with the military embargo, there was another war, the War of 1973, known as the October War, or the Israelis call it the Yom Kippur War. And it was a war in which Israel almost lost. It almost lost because it relied on domestic weapons, which were inferior to the weapons used by Syria and Egypt, which were Soviet weapons and which were just better weapons. Well, better in the sense more deadly. I don't think a weapon is a good thing, and I don't want to use positive words. But in the middle of that war, the United States intervened by giving Israel a lot of American-made weapons, and that changed the course of the war. And this was the only reason that Israel survived the war. Now, Israel is now 50 years later making the same mistake, and again thinking that it could just make its own weapons, and it cannot. Now, and Elbit Systems has maybe learned something from that mistake by creating a kind of niche economy where they specialize not in weapons of conventional warfare, but rather in weapons of repression, in weapons of mass surveillance and incarceration of entire populations. These are the trademark weapons of Elbit Systems. And these are also the weapons that gave Elbit Systems the reputation of a company of occupation, of apartheid, of repression, and also of assassination. So this is a company with a very, very bad reputation. And the fact that the insurance companies have dropped the Elbit Systems is not, as you say, and I agree, it's not because of moral qualms, but Allianz, which is one of Europe's largest insurance companies, has been targeted by a very effective and very consistent BDS campaign because of its investment in Elbit Systems and its insuring of Elbit Systems. So Allianz is responding to people saying, why should we buy your insurance? Why should we trust you as an insurance company if you have no red lines, if you are willing to invest in this company? But there is a difference between investing in a company, which is something an insurance company would do because they have all this money from the premiums and they have to invest it. And the other thing is to insure the company itself. And what Allianz, also Aviva, did is they stopped insuring Elbit Systems because they know that if this company's factories or arms shipments or research and development or any part of the supply chain is disrupted by activists, then this action is actually legal and protected by international law. So of course, the disruption has to be done in a clever way, in a way that is also consulted by lawyers. And I do want the listeners not to get the wrong ideas that I'm just saying that go find the nearest Elbit Systems factory and attack it. Please act in a responsible and sustainable way, and do talk to a lawyer and organize an effective and sustainable campaign. But there are organizations who are doing this, who are organizing these sustainable campaigns. Elbit Systems already had ships carrying their weapons deflagged by the governments that are giving the flags to the ships, or the crews or the operating company refuse to deliver the weapons. And in those moments, it's the insurance company that has to step in and pay the company. So why would they do this? Why would you insure something that you know is about to be disrupted? I mean, it's just bad business. So this, of course, puts Elbit Systems in a very difficult situation in which they would have to find some insurance company that would be willing to insure them. It gets more and more difficult, and at the last resort, they have to go to the Israeli government and say, "You will insure us." So it gives you an idea of where those $110 billion, which are purely theoretical, but if they are going to be spent, they're going to be spent on things like this, like insuring instead of what insurance companies are not willing to insure. And also, it's important to point out that Elbit Systems always had a very clear policy of trying to present itself as a normal arms company which lives up to the standards of NATO. So, of course, they cannot say that they're a moral or an ethical company because they are creating weapons that kill, but that they are at least following some basic ethical principles and not selling to various militias or criminal organizations and so on, as other Israeli arms companies often do. Okay, this is the difference between Elbit Systems and other Israeli arms companies. And they often sell their weapons to authoritarian regimes, to countries that are already under military embargo, like South Sudan. And Elbit Systems didn't want to do this because they want the very lucrative contracts with NATO countries. And now the procurement agency of NATO has disqualified Elbit Systems, and two of the workers of Elbit Systems have been arrested, one in the US and one in Brussels, over charges of corruption, over evidence that they have paid bribes. Now, this is still an ongoing investigation. I cannot tell you if they're going to be convicted or not, but what I can say is that it shows us a lot about NATO, that they are willing to suspend a company over suspicion of corruption, but not over suspicion of genocide. So it's also, Elbit Systems' downfall is in many ways an indication of the downfall of Western hegemony, because the NATO countries can no longer say, we are protecting democracy and we are, the armies of liberal democracies and protecting human rights against dangerous countries from the Soviet bloc that no longer exists. But now they are actively willing to trade with genocidaires and to arm genocidaires, but they still have problem with corruption and paying bribes. I do think that the fact that Elbit Systems has gotten to the point where there's sufficient evidence to arrest its workers over alleged bribes and also to suspend them is also a sign that Elbit Systems' own operations are getting more desperate. They're also feeling very much the pressure from the growing military embargo.
Yeah, getting uncareful. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, NATO being the one of the arms of U.S. empire definitely has no problem with genociders. And I wanted to kind of shift a little bit in the time we have left to talk about. I mean, we've been dancing around psychology, but the Hasbara machine, Israel putting millions of dollars into influencing ChatGPT, among other things. Earlier this month, another 2 billion shekels were budgeted for Hasbara to, quote, fund social media campaigns, collaborate with civil society organizations, and bring delegations of leaders, elected officials, influencers, and others to Israel. And this is what the government said in a statement. So first of all, I wanted to ask you, a bit like the $110 billion, is this money actually something that's going to this currently, or that is going to do this? And what do you think that'll look like, considering, you mentioned in Greece, like they're looking at other news. There is other news, even if Israel is able to contort and distort something like AI, or the Hasbara machine has not done well over the past couple of years since October 7th. So what do you think the effects would be if in fact that money is real?
Yeah, I thought we're going to have a longer conversation about the Asbara thing, I was going to suggest maybe that you would get on the show some of the investigative journalists from a German newspaper called Taz and from a French investigative journalism organization called Mediapart, who have exposed a very serious scandal with Israeli Asbara. And these investigative journalists will be able to give you much more interesting information than I can, because they've exposed that those trips that German delegates are taking to visit Israel and to only meet, with a very certain kind of Israelis, with they get a very one-sided picture. It's a propaganda tour, is of a value of about 5,000 euros per participant. And German members of parliament are obligated to report any gift that they receive of a value of more than 3,000 euros. And about 50 of the German members of parliament who went on those trips failed to report it. And the penalty is 5 to 10 years in prison for failing to report a gift of this value. So we're talking about bribery on a much bigger scale, even than the Elbit system story. And this is from Germany, but in France, there's also a very interesting thing in which the European version of IPAC is called the Elnet. APAC is active in the United States, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. Elnet is operating in Europe, and they claimed not to have received money from the Israeli government, but then they funded an event at the Senate of France for 75,000 euros at the expense of the Israeli government, which is an assault on French sovereignty. So these are big scandals. These are very serious things, and they're also illegal. In every country, the question of what you can do to promote your country or to promote certain ideas is different. Like in the United States, there's a lot of restriction about acting as a foreign agent. You have to report it, and it makes it difficult to receive donations and so on.
Unless you're Israel, though.
Well, actually, that's not true, because the biggest Hasbara organization in the United States, which was called TIP, the Israel Project, went bankrupt. The reason it went bankrupt is because its donors said, we are afraid that we're going to have to register ourselves as foreign agents, and we refused to do so. So the biggest Hasbara organization in the United States collapsed. So it's not, there are limits to what Israel can do, even in the United States. And in Europe, the laws are different. In Germany, for example, it is actually legal to promote foreign interests, and there are countries who do this in Germany. But Israel is doing it also in a way that has been proven to be illegal with Elnet by members of the parliament who failed to report that they went on the trip and received this gift. I mean, if they had reported it, it would have been very disgusting, but not illegal. So just to make this distinction. Now, Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gideon Saar, gave an interview, and he said in the interview recently, he said that Israel is not just working on lobbying governments with organizations such as Elnet, but also trying to sway public opinion on the grassroots level by those, such as the social media influence that you mentioned, or influencing chatbots like the AI chatbots, or by actually promoting articles on normal newspapers which contain Hasbara information and bias. And this campaign is clearly not working, because the public opinion is going in the opposite direction. So you have governments who are being lobbied in the most aggressive ways, and including in illegal ways, as has been proven, while the majority of the population in Europe is not buying into this Hasbara. And I think that you've asked about the money. So you mentioned 2 million shekels. 2 million shekels is nothing. It's about $700,000. So it's not something that can be compared to $110 billion for weapons, right? So it's not so hard for Israel to spend 2 million shekels or something. That's a very small amount. But but it is important for the Israeli government to try to convince its own public that it is spending money on Hasbara and that it is making progress in swaying public opinion in Europe, because the Israelis, who are horrified by what is happening to the image of Israelis abroad, and their response is to lose faith in the future of their own state. And so the Israeli government really has to convince the Israelis. So it's not about convincing the Europeans, it's about convincing the Israelis. But I've just seen an article which on an Israeli newspaper where the annual comparison of national brands is shown. Like there's a list of all the countries in the world, and Israel once again came last place in the world. Israel's brand value is less than North Korea. So I don't think anyone can claim that Hasbara is working, not even to the Israeli public.
Yeah, well, and that's interesting. You know, the idea of U.S. propaganda is really to manufacture consent here. It's not to convince people abroad that we're this wonderful nation, because most people abroad have figured that out. So yeah, it's interesting, the necessity of propaganda turned inwards. Well, we have, I mean, I also thought we were going to spend more time on that, but I also have more questions. But alas, time is sometimes not on our side, and so we'll just have to have you back again to talk about all these things. So, Dr. Hever, thank you so much for taking the time to go through all of this and to dig deeper into this and contextualize it. It's very important, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.